In recent times, Mexico's ever-growing government has been not only expanding their expenditures on the social welfare of their people, but also putting lots of expenditures into growing their military, which has been cause for concern for several nations, including that of Ecuador, Chile, and for some reason, America. However, with this being the case, we are posed with today's question as to whether or not anybody should indeed have reasonable worry or suspicion for the growing of Mexico's military. And we have to say no, for the following three reasons. By number one, understanding our social standing with Mexico, to which secondly, we will unpack and understand why Mexico's growing military is actually a positive for their social well-being, and finally, understanding the actual actions Mexico has taken by growing their military. So, to start with, when answering today's question as to whether or not anybody should be worried about Mexico's growing military, let me give you a little bit of a basis for statistics as to how they've been using this growth in the current status quo. So, to do this, we have to start by understanding basic statistics about the growth currently and the expenditures that the government has been giving to said military. And by this, we can look at the navaltechnology.com, who stated back in September 2nd of 2022 that Mexico has actually started spending upwards of $8.9 billion to 8.8 to 8.9 billion dollars with their expenditures. Now, this has been a dramatic growth from the $6 billion that they used to spend just years prior. However, just because they have indeed been spending more money is no cause for alarm. Continuing on, even though Mexico has indeed been giving more money to fund their military, we've also seen, according to the Washington Post, they stated back in December of 2020 that Mexico has actually been growing their military as much as 20%, which again, it's not alarming for the status quo, but is simple statistics that were predicted based on the likelihood that any government is going to grow. And in recent times, Mexico has had need to grow their government and their military for their own strength. However, again, this is not a cause for concern because, again, under Mexico's newest presidency, specifically Andres Manuel Lopez, they have understood that the statistics of growth under his presidency have significantly increased since coming into power. And under Lopez Obrador, the number of soldiers involved in domestic disputes have also grown around 66,000%, or not percent, but in terms of 66,000 people on average. So, understanding the basis for how much growth has actually been seen in Mexico, we can see that this is actually very little. And if there was any cause for concern for war or civil chaos within the nation, that growth should be much higher than what we've seen in current times. However, going on to our second point of analysis today, when understanding our social dealings with Mexico, we as American citizens have no reason to fear, for what has been going on between us as a country and Mexico has been respectively peaceful. NPR.com stated back in 2020, specifically July 24th, that ever since Trump has left the office and we have gotten new presidency within the United States, specifically that of Joe Biden, American dealings with Mexico have been not just neutral, but actually plausible and peaceful. And even during the Trump presidency, tensions weren't perhaps positive, but they were on a neutral plane, knowing that not only between America and Mexico, trade had actually increased under the Trump presidency by 33%, and under the current Biden presidency, we still see that trade is an all-time high, and Mexico is one of our biggest nations for imports and exports. Understanding this basis, we can see that when it comes to a larger military, it's only to be understood that within the current social status and the times that we live in today, not only with the Ukraine being invaded, but also various social impacts plaguing the country of Mexico with not only the war on drugs, but the war on terror and the betterment of the social strata. Mexico as a country has had respectively good ties with all of its neighbors, with the exception of some countries including Ecuador and maybe Cuba. With these being the case, as Americans, we have nothing to fear, and just because they have had some growth in their military, we have indeed been funding Mexico and giving them additional funds, according to, again, the naval technology. And so this was only to be expected, not to be feared. And finally, when concluding today's speech and answering the question as to if anyone should be worried about Mexico's growing government, we have to finally understand what has been happening in Mexico to cause them to want to grow their military in the first place. Well, to do this, just looking back in history, we have to go back to a post that was done by the New York Times on August 16th of 2020, in which we saw that the war on drugs was getting worse because of the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, something that had already carried on from the early 70s and 80s and had been plaguing Mexico for far too long. In fact, statistics had told us, according to Statistico.com, back in 2021, that when looking at the Mexican demographic, 1 in every 15 people in Mexico was shown to either have taken or had been currently taking illegal illicit substances, according to American statistics. So, with this being the case, the government itself, specifically the president over Mexico residing, has given a public statement when answering the questions as to why people have been seen to have more police control, or as they call it, state presence within the streets of civilians. And this was predominantly to take care of this war when it comes to terror caused by drugs and illicit substances. So, with that being the case, we have to go on to a second aspect, which comes down to domestic abuse and violence according to civilians, or against civilians. When it comes to street crime and gang-related violence, it has been at an all-time high, specifically in 2022, when there were multiple lockdowns and nobody to really maintain the peace or have a really good economic presence when it comes to maintaining law and order within the streets of Mexico. However, the insider tells us that multiple scandals under the growing Mexican government's presence have elicited the growing crime and the lack of military presence. Therefore, by adding more police officers on the streets, they wish to mitigate this. So, with all of these factors being taken into account, we can undeniably close today's speech by answering that no, nobody should be worried about the growing government and the growing Mexican military for the following 3 reasons. By number 1, starting with an understanding and basis of our ties with Mexico socially. Number 2, seeing the statistics and the actual analysis behind the growth. And number 3, understanding the social issues that plague the country of Mexico. So again, Mexico is at an all-time high right now for social welfare and the benefit of their people. And with a growing government and a growing military, we hope to regain the same peace that we once had as a country for the state. Thank you.